All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Bonds, we will be starting in just 1 minute, so grab a cup of coffee and we'll be with you shortly. Hi everyone, my name is Joanna Ain from Prosperity Now, and I'd like to welcome you to A Brighter Future with Baby Bonds, How States and Cities Should Invest in Our Kids. I am an Associate Director of Policy, and I'm going to quickly take you through a brief housekeeping slide before I turn it over to our amazing speakers. We are so pleased to be running this event with our amazing friends at the New School, Schools Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy. So this event will be recorded and made available to registrants. All attendees are muted to ensure sound quality. Ask a question or share your thoughts anytime by typing into the text box of your GoToWebinar control panel. And if you experience any technical issues, you can just email GoToWebinar@prosperitynow.org. Also, just want to let you know we will be live tweeting today's events. So you can follow us on Twitter @ProsperityNow, and you can join the conversation with #BabyBonds. So we hope to see you there. So right now, I'm going to be turning it over to Prosperity Now's CEO and President, Gary Cunningham.
Thank you, Joanna. Really appreciate being here today. You are in for a treat today, everyone. Welcome to A Brighter Future with Baby Bonds, How States and Cities Should Invest in Our Kids. I want to thank you for being here. And I also want to say that this event really is about changing the future of this country so that everyone, no matter where they live, no matter where they come from, can actually fully participate in our economic systems. I'm Gary Cunningham, as Joanna said, President and CEO of Prosperity Now. This event is co-hosted by our fantastic partners, the Institute on Race, Power, and the Political Economy at the New School. The Institute's founder, director, Dr. Darrick Hamilton, who originated this idea of baby bonds, will speak later. But I just want to say, when I was growing up, they had a commercial of you walk into a room and somebody would be listening to their broker and everybody would turn. So when Darrick Hamilton, who has been leading this work on racial economic justice in this country for many years, speaks, everyone should listen. Our organizations have collaborated to bring you this event to take a deep dive into our new co-authored paper, A Brighter Future with Baby Bonds, How States and Cities Should Invest in Our Kids. I want to thank both our organization staff for really going all out, both on co-authoring the paper, but also on this event. Now, I want to tell you just for a minute, just step back for a minute, of why I strongly believe in this idea of baby bonds. As a racial justice advocate, I believe that everyone should have the opportunity to build wealth in America. Not just a few that already obtained generational wealth, but everyone. Baby bonds can provide children from low wealth households who are disproportionately Black, Latinx, and Indigenous the opportunity to secure a brighter future. With a small nest egg, you can make a big difference in building wealth and transforming America. when every child, especially children of color, born into families struggling to make ends meet, have the opportunity, we will be able to set up families, generation, and communities to live and thrive with dignity. Now, Prosperity Now's mission is to foster an economy that is just, fair, and free from structural racism, where every person, family, and community has the power to build sustainable wealth and prosperity. And I believe that baby bonds can go a long way towards achieving this mission. Our baby bonds work at Prosperity Now actually began many years ago with the work that we've done over the last 2 decades on children's savings account. We continue to support children's savings accounts. We believe that they are a vehicle, but not the only vehicle that get us to justice and address the racial wealth divide in America. We need policies that go beyond just educational supports to give children and adults, young adults of color, the capital they need to begin building wealth over their lifetime. Over the past few years, Prosperity Now has taken our experience working with CSAs, especially in terms of how to structure and manage accounts, as well as extensive experience and expertise in developing wealth building policies and apply them to promoting baby bonds. In 2018, we assisted Senator Cory Booker's staff in developing the American Opportunity Accounts Act, which could create a national baby bonds program. We also collaborated with Dr. Hamilton on a paper in early 2020, what a national CSA policy would look like. For those of you that might not have expertise or know the topic at all, let me just give you a little bit of a primer here so that you can actually understand what baby bonds are. So baby bonds really are, very simply, the government sets aside money for a child near birth, and that money grows. The government makes a substantial deposit for each child, with the largest endowment for children with households with the least wealth. The government invests these funds on behalf of the children, or these children, and with those funds, over time, they grow appreciably. When they are adults, recipients use the funds to acquire assets that generate wealth and economic security, such as buying a home, post-secondary education, or starting a business. By investing in children with the largest investment provided to households with the least wealth, over time, baby bonds will help narrow the racial wealth divide in America. While baby bonds would have a tremendous impact, I also want to acknowledge that baby bonds are not a panacea. We know that the situations that low-income families find themselves in, particularly indigenous, African-American, Latino populations, and other people of color find themselves in today, is not because of one thing. It will take a plethora of policies to address some of the systemic structural issues of racism in our economy today. And our panel will discuss these issues later. Federal baby bonds legislation remains our North Star at Prosperity Now and for the Institute. Since only the federal government has the resources and the reach needed to create a program to scale to close the racial wealth divide in America. However, states and local governments don't have to wait for federal action. They can create their own baby bonds programs now to begin to provide young adults with the foundational capital to start building wealth. And today you'll learn 2 locations have already started doing this, Connecticut and the District of Columbia, which both passed baby bonds legislation last year. We're now in a moment where the need for bold, transformative policies like baby bonds is something needed like never before. The COVID pandemic laid bare and further exacerbated the long-standing racial and ethnic inequalities in America. In this event today, we will talk about the concrete actions state and cities can take to address the disparities and economic inequalities that exist in your town, and to transform our economy to an inclusive one where everyone can thrive. The event will be moderated by the wonderful Kimberly Adams, who is host of Marketplace on public radio, where she covers the intersection of politics and the economy. Our first panel will be on implementing baby bonds at the state and local level, and will include two pioneers on baby bonds policy: Connecticut Treasurer Shawn T and our own Washington, D.C. Councilmember Kenyan McDuffie, along with Shira Markoff, Shira Markoff, Policy Fellow at Prosperity Now, one of the co-authors of this fantastic report, A Brighter Future with Baby Bonds. Well, then after that, we'll have a quick video that was generously shared by the Connecticut Voices for Children, in which we will hear from residents about the impact of the Connecticut program. Kimberly will moderate our second panel, Reimagining an America that Empowers People to Thrive, which will feature Dr. Darrick Hamilton and Dr. David Grumsky, professor at Stanford University. They will discuss how baby bonds can be part of a larger agenda to ensure that all people, especially people of color and those with low incomes, have the income and wealth they need to thrive. Before I turn it over to Kimberly, we're going to hear from New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, a great partner who has been instrumental in raising up the idea of baby bonds in the national conversation. We are so grateful to him. He is an advocate and a strong advocate for creating programs that work for everyone.
Hello, thank you everyone, and thank you Senator Booker for that video. My name is Kimberly Adams. I'm a host and correspondent at the public radio program Marketplace, which is a business and economy program that airs on over 800 stations across the United States, and we have a suite of podcasts that are heard by millions of listeners. Thank you very much for the organizers for inviting me to moderate this very interesting and exciting panel. I'm going to move very quickly through the biographies of our panelists who are coming up so that we can get to their insights and also to your questions. So first we have Connecticut Treasurer Shawn T, who was sworn in as Connecticut State Treasurer in 2019. And he also serves as the president of the National Association of State Treasurers. Welcome, Treasurer T. And we also have DC Councilmember Kenyan McDuffie, who has represented Ward 5 in the DC Council since 2012. Welcome, Councilmember. And of course, Shira Markoff, who's a policy fellow at Prosperity Now and a co-author of the paper that's being featured in this event, A Brighter Future with Baby Bonds, How States and Cities Should Invest in Our Kids. And Shira, I'll start with you. What does an ideal baby bonds piece of legislation or initiative look like for people who are trying to push it from your perspective?
Thanks, Kimberly. Well, as we talked about in our paper, there are some fundamental essential elements of baby bonds. Of course, we do recognize that when you actually get down to the legislative process, there are a lot of other considerations, but this is kind of the foundation. So the first piece is a substantial monetary endowment. And, we can't kind of say this is the one amount that means substantial, but basically there should be enough money in the account that when children reach adulthood, they can use the money towards the purchase of one of those wealth building assets we've talked about. So a home, a small business, or post-secondary education. The second piece is that children from the lowest wealth households would receive higher amounts. And so if, in order to address the racial wealth divide, we want to make sure the most money goes towards children from those households with the lowest wealth, which are disproportionately Black, Latinx, and Indigenous. The next piece is automatic enrollment. So we want to ensure that everybody participates in the program. So automatic enrollment is an important way to do that. The next is that funds are restricted to wealth generating assets. So, if we truly want to close the racial wealth divide, we want to make sure that those funds are going towards assets that are going to grow in value over time and provide economic security. Another piece is really focusing on endowments rather than deposits. So the purpose of these accounts is really to set up a trust for children for when they are older rather than emphasizing family deposits. Another piece that's really important is having a sustainable funding source. So these are long-term accounts. We want them to be there for kids when they're older. And so having some kind of dedicated funding source that isn't going to, change when political winds or budget constraints change is really important. And then finally, we want to make sure that children's families are not in any way penalized for having this money for their children's future. And so the funds should be excluded from any asset limits for state benefits. And the last piece I'll add there, it wasn't in our essential elements, it was in others, but I truly think it is essential, which is having community input into the program. So we want to make sure that the communities, the families that are going to be most impacted by this program have the chance to provide their thoughts on the implementation and ongoing operations of the program.
Thank you, Shira. So to see what this kind of looks like on the ground in an implementation, Treasurer Wooden, Connecticut and DC were the first places in the country to enact baby bonds legislation. What was that process like in Connecticut, and how did you land on the design of your program?
Okay, I think you can hear me now.
Yes.
So our process was a lot of basic organizing, and starting with, we're in a moment in this country where my thinking and others is that we got to go bold, we got to go big, racial disparities, wealth gap expanding, and we've got a moment in time where America's watching, citizens of Connecticut are watching, And so we have the political space to perhaps go bigger and bolder. And so that sets the landscape. And with that, actually designed is just having conversations with key stakeholders and building, prior to the introduction of legislation, socializing the concept and getting faith, labor leaders, parent activist groups, others, building the momentum around this, key legislative caucuses, and introducing the concept, getting feedback that would later inform program design. And so the design features, our program initially, I would say, was modeled off of Senator Booker and Ayanna Pressley's, what they proposed, with some important distinctions, which in our case, it was, talking about the realities of implementing this or getting this passed. We don't have as many resources as the federal government. And so the program had to be very targeted, and ours is just directed at poor children. And so no steps, but poor based on if you qualify for the state's Medicaid program in terms of the mom that's giving birth. So that targeted approximately 16,000 babies born a year for that. And then getting, and all the features just laid out in terms of ideal design, happily, I was holding my breath to say, are we ideal? And the answer is largely yes, all of those features. An initial endowment contribution from the state. We have gotten through the legislature bond authorization for $50 million a year for the next 12 years to fund this program for that cohort. Funds targeted towards those wealth building activities, higher education, home ownership, investment in a business, retirement, savings, security, but that category. One of the interesting things that actually built support was a requirement that the beneficiaries go through a financial literacy education. That small tweak was actually pretty powerful for legislators, I'd say for some good reasons and for some bad reasons in terms of assumptions that people make, but that was a very good addition to the program. And so those were, and getting it through, it ended up being voted on a bipartisan basis. And I would describe that as just doing the work, building the coalitions outside of the Capitol and engaging the stakeholders, including Republicans, who through the process were fairly quiet on it. And out of the committee process, nobody voted no, but they didn't vote yes. When it got to the full legislature and put into the budget, it was voted on a bipartisan basis.
Councilmember McDuffie, how different was that process here in DC?
You know what? It wasn't all that different, actually. I'll tell you, I think with us, we wanted to make sure we build a large enough tent to ensure that we got it right and that we got input from the folks who are going to be impacted by this. Similarly to Treasurer Wooten, we looked at Senator Booker, Congresswoman Presley's proposals, along with white papers on this issue. Obviously, the work that Darrick Hamilton has been doing has been incredibly important, and he was absolutely essential in helping with the hearing that we conducted here in the District of Columbia on the measure that I authored. And we really weighed various program design elements against the realities here in Washington, D.C. For instance, we knew that we wanted a program to directly chip away at what is in the District of Columbia one of the starkest racial wealth gaps of any city in the United States, which meant we really need to focus on lower income households. We also knew that we needed to design a program that started at a child's birth with the benefit of compound interest, which is absolutely essential, and time. We wanted youth to have access to a very meaningful amount of money to later invest in the wealth building opportunities that you all before me have already articulated. And again, this program was really meant to ensure that a young person's ability to escape what for many families in the nation's capital has been a cycle of poverty and hopefully pass down some wealth to later generations. And so we were able to be very intentional about allowing the funds to be used for those types of activities that would help to build some wealth and create opportunities for young people who heretofore haven't necessarily been able to experience that. And so we're really proud of the program we were able to develop. We vetted the proposal with various advocacy groups and stakeholders, some of whom also testified at the hearing that we have. And fortunately, I think that our efforts, all the contributions of the people that I mentioned, just immense amount of due diligence paid off. And my colleagues on the council immediately saw the benefit of the program that we had designed and supported the measure unanimously with their votes and the $32 million that we funded it with.
Can I also say something that was very important, and just mentioning Darrick Hamilton and all the work that was done in advance in terms of the intellectual framework around this was critically important. The notion that I as treasurer could go from 0 to 60 in one legislative session with a concept and pass it is just, it's impossible. And so the ability to have that body of work and that intellectual academic rigor around it, and to sell that as part of the vision from a policy perspective, that was foundational to having that. And likewise, I think the work of implementing this is ultimately going to be foundational, on the state and local level, will be foundational to the federal government, which I've been with Senator Booker and others at the Capitol advocating for federal passage. But our work in terms of being laboratories and front runners, I think will be critical in terms of helping elevate this at the national level.
Ms. Markoff, where else is there action happening throughout the country on this? Are any other states or localities trying to push their own baby bonds legislation?
Yeah, absolutely. So New Jersey actually was one of the earlier ones proposing legislation. Governor Phil Murphy had proposed legislation in 2020, which ultimately didn't pass, but there is still pending legislation there. More recently, Washington State has had a baby bonds bill that's been pushed by their treasurer, Mike Pelliciotti. And it did pass through some initial policy committees, but unfortunately they're going through a short legislative cycle, so it wasn't able to get any further. But they were even able to get some bipartisan support to Republican sponsors between the House and the Senate there. So that's another place we're seeing activity. In California, there's been a proposal to provide account for children who lost a parent or caregiver to COVID-19. That's building off of this idea. It's a little bit of a different idea, but you can see how the idea is out there and it's kind of being iterated on in different contexts and for different purposes. I think it's important to say that the federal legislation is still our North Star, as Gary had said. Only the federal government has the resources and scopes to fully close the racial wealth divide, but it's really exciting to see that states and cities aren't waiting for the federal government with this closely divided Congress we have to act, and are starting to really kind of take these initiatives themselves.
I'll remind everyone to please submit your questions in the Q&A box in the webinar template, and we'll get to those in just a moment. But before we do, Councilmember McDuffie and Treasurer Wooten, I know that there are a lot of ideas floating around about how to address poverty and wealth inequality. What was some of the pushback that you received, and how did you address that? Councilmember McDuffie first.
Well, I think some of the pushback we saw was from people who felt like this wasn't going to have the immediate impact that some other programs might have. And I think it was fair to make that type of statement. But ultimately, I think the process of vetting the proposal that we drafted with stakeholders really helped us generate this sort of buy-in, and to really convey that what we're doing is meant to be a longer-term solution to eradicating the racial wealth gap. It is not to supplant all the other things that we can do, which immediately provide support for those people living in poverty. But it wasn't as easy to sell as many wanted the proceeds to be available immediately or be used for some sort of immediate expenses that people might have. But because my team and I knew that families and youth also needed immediate financial support to ease their, I think, more imminent financial burdens, in the same budget cycle, I authored legislation that created a guaranteed income pilot program for lower income households. And so we were fortunate in the District of Columbia to have the availability of funding to do multiple things. But I think many people, after the process of having a hearing, some of the outreach that we did, really amplifying the voices of people like Darrick Hamilton and so many others who've been leaders on this issue, we were able to make a compelling case that this sort of long-term investment is precisely what's needed for lower income families and trying to break the cycle of poverty that exists in the District of Columbia.
Treasurer Wooten, what was it like in Connecticut?
So I would say that was one of the #1 issues or concerns, and you have different buckets. You have those who are naturally sympathetic and supportive. That's the critique. Those who aren't, and there's a different critique, right? So on that point, yes, we agreed there are immediate needs, but I made the case that we have to think differently, longer term, bigger, bolder, if we're gonna have transformational change. And that, yes, this is different, and it's hard in the legislature where you're on a 2-year cycle for re-election, and what have you done? It's a different way of thinking, but making the case, if we're gonna be transformative, we have to think and invest in long-term ways. And so that was one bucket. Another one was actually explaining to people, there are people who don't like programs that are just directed at one group or a perception of minorities. And, and walking through Connecticut, we have 169 towns, and getting a list of how many participants on state Medicaid in each town, and being able to show that list and to say, we actually have poverty and people on Medicaid in 169 towns in Connecticut. That includes places like Greenwich, Connecticut, which we think of as wealth, and Darien and some others. And so that was powerful in terms of expanding the coalition and saying this is actually, wealth inequality touches everyone, and disproportionately Black and Brown folks. And so that's why this will help close that racial disparity gap. But getting people to understand that this impacts lots of communities was also very powerful.
Thank you so much. So we're going to move to audience questions now, and if I can ask you all to answer these as concisely as possible, just because we're short on time. Shira, I'm going to start with you. There's a question: would the bonds also be excluded from FAFSA, for example? And someone else also asked, have either the Connecticut or DC baby bonds programs managed to figure out a way to exclude funds from consideration for federally mandated asset limits? So, I see on the list here that it's excluded from state benefits, but what do we do about the federal question?
I actually might defer to Treasurer Wooten on that one, because I know that Connecticut has really been a pioneer in working with Senator Booker's office on that, and also thinking through the tax implications. So I think that the state legislation will exclude state benefits, as you said, and from state financial aid, but on the federal side, I'll defer to the Treasurer.
Yes, and I'll be short. The answer is no, not today. But we are working on that, and I've been in discussions with Senator Booker and others on the Hill.
All right, then I'll ask Councilmember McDuffie and also Treasurer Wooten a question. What partnerships are necessary to execute this program? Have you aligned different systems and technology to make this possible? Councilmember McDuffie?
Sure. So in the District of Columbia, we have what we refer to as an independent office of the Chief Financial Officer. And so the CFO in the DC is not an extension of the executive or the legislative branch. And in that sense, we have to partner with the Chief Financial Officer in order to administer this program. And the Office of the Chief Financial Officer has been absolutely integral in our ability to craft this program, much like the 529 college savings program that we have here in the District of Columbia. And so, and we've been able to get it off the ground and pretty much model the implementation similar to what they're already doing, so as to not spend as much time perhaps as we ordinarily would starting from scratch. And so the CFO's office has been an absolutely essential partner with the council and the executive in trying to begin this program in the District of Columbia.
Anything different for you, Treasurer Wooten?
Well, one of the biggest things is just getting state government to talk to each other and to do information sharing. So for example, our Department of Social Services, they're a critical component to the automatic enrollment feature. But in order to do that, we have to share information, across parts of government. And there are some complications with respect to Medicaid privacy rules, HIPAA, but just working through those issues both legislatively and intergovernmental agency-wide.
Last question for you, Ms. Markoff. In the absence of federal legislation, someone wants to know how these efforts can be supported in the meantime.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, as I said, there are efforts in a number of states. We would encourage people to, sign up for Prosperity Now's network and find out about opportunities to support legislation in your states. And we have a number of resources that can support people in advocating for this. And I think it's really great that states and cities are paving the way. And I think, obviously it's beneficial to the children in those places, but it certainly does also help the momentum towards federal legislation. So just encourage people to use our resources and contact us about how they can get more involved.
Thank you so much, Shira Markoff, Kenyan McDuffie, and Shawn Wooten. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Now, before we move on to the next panel, we are going to play a brief video that the Connecticut Voices for Children has generously shared to give us some perspectives on what the people actually using these programs are thinking about it. thanks again to Connecticut Voices for Children for letting us use that video. And so now we are ready to move on to our next panel, some of our ability to think broader about this topic and place it into the national conversation with Darrick Hamilton, who you all have heard quite a bit about already on this panel. But nevertheless, he's the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy at the New School and the founding director of the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School, and also a co-author on this paper that this panel is about today. And we're also joined by David Grusky, who is the Edward Ames Edmonds Professor in the School of Humanities and Sciences at Stanford University. He's also a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic and Policy Research, a faculty fellow at the Center for Population Health Sciences, and the director of the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality. You both have quite a few titles. Welcome.
Thank you.
Dr. Hamilton, I'll start with you. Can you place this work in the broader context of the national conversation about wealth inequality right now?
Yeah, I mean, this program takes wealth head on. The problem with wealth inequality is that some people are born with capital and some people aren't. I mean, when we look at wealth, the critical ingredient in order to build wealth is wealth. It is wealth that begets more wealth. So this fits within a genre in general of perhaps how we're moving to take poverty and inequality directly on. The reason why people are poor is because they lack resources. The reason why we have gross inequality is because some have a lot more than others. So we need a public sector that levels the playing field in a more just way. Not simply by just giving people something, but rather empowering people, providing the necessary ingredients so that they can actually build wealth, providing the necessary ingredients so that they can engage in productive manners in the economy, rather than being at the whim of economic forces because they lack power and they lack resources.
Dr. Grusky, what about you? How do you place this in the national conversation at the moment?
Yeah, I was listening to what Darrick just said. I think one follow-up on this is that, of course, this is a bold and transformational proposal, no doubt about it. But at the same time, there's a sense in which it's very tame and mainstream. It's tame and mainstream because it's all about providing equal opportunity, one of our country's supposedly most fundamental commitments, honored in the breach. As Cory Booker noted, and I think it's worth reemphasizing that point, it's really about saying that as a country, we should live up to our commitment to the American dream. It shouldn't be a shallow commitment. It shouldn't be a lip service commitment. It shouldn't be one of those meaningless talking points, trotted out in an election. We have an opportunity to go beyond all that and to authentically commit to that principle and make our institutions come a bit closer to aligning with what people believe in.
We is doing quite a bit of work there because we don't all agree that baby bonds are the best way in this country to address wealth inequality. How much federal support, because we heard earlier that the federal legislation is the North Star for people pushing baby bonds, how much federal support is there for a federal baby bonds legislation? Either one of you, go for it.
I mean, it's certainly growing. It's certainly more today than there was 5-10 years ago. As Senator Booker pointed out, there are at least 15 senators that are willing to co-sponsor it. But like any policy, we shouldn't wait on the federal government. We can build at local and state levels, which, as you can see today from Councilman McDuffie as well as Senator Wooten, that we're already starting to do that, and they're not alone. And at the end of the day, we can always quote FDR, we make them do it. We build up momentum. So, and then I'll say one last thing, and that is the thing that will definitely get in the way of this occurring is pessimism. If we just resound ourselves to despair, then the status quo will prevail. But in order to get justice, we have to actively demand it. And sorry, I said one last thing, but also baby bonds is not the only solution. I think we need to make that clear. Baby bonds is a prospective policy that ensures that everybody has a birthright to capital. But we can also talk about the complement of reparations. We can also talk about a wealth tax that breaks up that concentration of wealth at the top in a way that's anti-democratic. Not that we begrudge people for having lots of wealth, but it's problematic when all that wealth can be used in a way to manipulate our political system to keep us from doing things that we need, like making us more climate resilient, for example.
When talking about this, you said that there are plenty of other options for addressing poverty and wealth inequality. How do you compare using baby bonds as a tool to something like expanding the child tax credit, something many people might be familiar with from the expansion that happened during the pandemic? Dr. Gresky?
Yeah, I think it's important to think about the two effects that baby bonds will have. The most important effect of baby bonds is that when children become adults, they'll have the capital needed to access opportunity. That's critical. But there's also a second effect. When children are growing up, they'll now know that opportunities that had once been unavailable are now available. And that means they'll approach their future differently, and that parents will need money. This is where the child tax credit comes in. Parents will need money to help their children prepare for that brighter future. In the video, we heard a direct quote: "Everyone wants an expected future," and it was noted that there is pushback in Connecticut and DC because it takes time for baby bonds to mature. But there will be an immediate effect. There will be a long-range effect, and that's huge and massive and transformational. There will also be an immediate effect that will change right now how children will think about their future, and we need parents to have the money, like guaranteed income, like child tax credit, so that they can help those dreams come to fruition.
Kimberly, just real quick, that there was one other quote in one of those videos that was so outstanding. The woman said, "Baby bonds are like a pillow for my child." What a great metaphor! I love that. So.
But what about this difference between what we're talking about with baby bonds is addressing wealth inequality, as opposed to something like the child tax credit, which has to do with, income. How do you balance investments in those things in terms of which is going to be the most efficacious in addressing some of these systemic economic inequalities that we see in our country?
So lots of dimensions of economic well-being, economic insecurity, and we get caught up and mired in the notions of scarcity. Oftentimes we say, well, what about this policy as opposed to another policy that are both important. For example, people need quality education, but they also need wealth. People need income to meet their basic needs and their day-to-day functioning, but they also need capital investments to have the long-term security that wealth provides. People need healthcare. So there are a set of enabling goods and services that people need. I mean, we're talking about metaphors. At one point, we were able to maintain 2 amphitheaters of war, both Iraq and Afghanistan. And the questions, I guess some people ask that question, but certainly we can afford to provide economic rights in multiple dimensions for people, and we should not be mirrored in the scarcity of having to sacrifice wealth for income.
How do you have that conversation, though, in our political system where scarcity is sort of the language of the day? I understand your point that you don't believe it's real, but then for people who are pushing proposals like this, how do you have that conversation on a national level? Go ahead, David, Darrick, whichever one of you wants to go for it.
I definitely defer to Darrick, but happy to say something at some point. Yeah.
You lead and I'll follow, David. How about that?
Okay. Well, I guess I think it's really important to look at the big picture here. This is a country that through this grand neoliberal experiment, we put everything on the market. We've even put access to opportunity on the market. Now, you might have thought, well, opportunity is sacred and we wouldn't have put it on the market, but we have. And so we've set up market institutions in which we need not just income, but wealth in order to take access. In order to take advantage of those opportunities. So we basically say, put the cash on the table if you want to train yourself and get a good job. Put the cash on the table if you want to access entrepreneurial opportunities. Put the cash on the table if you want to passively accumulate wealth through home ownership. That's a society and economy that we have. That's the reality of it. To make that work, a society in which even opportunity requires wealth, we have to provide everyone with at least some capital, the capital that's the entry price into accessing some of the most important opportunities in play. So those opportunities are now available to people born into wealth. That's not equal opportunity. That's opportunity for those born into wealth. And so I think that's why addressing the wealth gap is all critical, all critical. Of course, there's an income gap. That's critical too, but we can't ignore. We ignore it at our peril, the wealth gap.
Yeah. And you know, I'm going to disagree with David in one dimension, which is I despise that word opportunity. I think we should exercise it from our political jargon. I think it's a political ruse. I think just like the neoliberal narrative that places merit solely on people's actions, inactions, capabilities or inabilities, without notions of power, without recognizing that any transaction requires people to come in with resources and power, is almost amplified by that word opportunity. Now, we know that the word literally doesn't mean that, but I think it's been manipulated in a political discourse to put the onus of inequality on people and not on structures. The reason that people are poor are because they lack resources. That's a definition. It's almost an identity. So poverty is a political choice. Right now, the way we have defined our economy and defined our narratives about opportunity and even the American dream has put the onus on individuals so much that we ignore structures. We protect property rights, but not economic rights, not human rights. We don't protect people, but we protect property. But we have we ignore all the immorality that has come about in the ways in which property has been distributed today. We ignore the ways in which we implemented federal policy and ways in which we incarcerated people, and then all of a sudden we want to protect private property. I think an alternative approach is, rather than using the market as a disciplinary mechanism, and here's where I know we agree, David, so it's not a juxtaposition. We need a society that empowers people so that they can reap the rewards of their ingenuity in an authentic way, so that they can reap the rewards of their hard work in an authentic way. And that's going to take time. That neoliberal vision didn't just occur overnight. It occurred over 30 years. And race was a mechanism by which they were able to implement that. And we could talk more about that. But likewise, we need economic rights framework. We need to make sure that people have the resources they need to thrive.
Dr. Gresky, a lot of your work focuses on economic mobility. What role do you think a program like a baby bonds program might play in, creating economic mobility when a lot of people believe that economic mobility has simply disappeared in recent generations?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of reason to be worried about the capacity to realize, this commitment to mobility, because it's just not there. And so then, as I was saying, the issue in part, not exclusively, but the issue in part is that you need money to access a capacity to be mobile. You need money. You need capital. If you want to be an entrepreneur, last I checked, you often need some startup capital. So that is not a type of mobility that's available unless you have the capital. If you want to get a job that pays well, last I checked, it often, not always, but often requires a high quality college education. You know what? We put that on the market. You need to pay for that. You need capital. You need to be able to take a pause a bit from working and focus on that training. And that means you need capital. And so if you have a society in which mobility depends so fundamentally on capital, you need to address the problem. You need to allow everyone, even those who were born into wealth, to have access to that type of mobility. Trying to get rid of opportunity for my phrases, Darrick. I'm working hard.
I saw that, David.
He's going to be paranoid for the rest of the conversation. Dr. Hamilton, I'm looking at the slide for this panel, Reimagining an America that Empowers People to Thrive. Is there any precedent for sort of resetting our minds and the way that we think about economic opportunity in this country, and who has access to what resources?
Yeah, I mean, it is almost as if my discipline of economists have almost pulled the wool over everybody's eyes and almost naturalizing this notion of what we have today, that the market is the essential best mechanism of distribution. But again, without notions of power. I'm not anti-markets. I'm not pro or against markets per se. But historically, we've had a precedent going back to coming out of the Great Depression. There was the New Deal, and then after that, there was the Great Society, when we did things like Social Security, where we said we're not going to tolerate people in the twilight of their life literally dying in the streets as paupers, that we're going to set up a Social Security system to protect them. We recognized with a Department of Agriculture that farmers needed some capital foundation in order to grow their farms. I mean, we can keep going with all the policies that came about. We did things like the Wagner Act that provided workers the bargaining power so they didn't just have to take what employers gave them, but could collectively organize in a way to fight back and work for better terms. Now, what was the critical ingredient that was missing in that revolution? It was not inclusive racially. We know that by design as well as implementation, Black people were largely excluded from the benefits that came about. One quick example, when Social Security was passed, it excluded domestic and agricultural workers. Even today, the Wagner Act excludes domestic and agricultural workers. Now, it didn't explicitly say Black people don't get Social Security, but when 90% of Black women engaged in work are a domestic or agricultural worker and over half of Black men, we know that that was a design issue that was racist, that was de facto racist. So today, we can learn from those lessons. Baby bonds is an example that learns from that lesson. But in this case, we can make sure that we're anti-racist in our approach, that we're not excluding people, but intentionally including people. So in order to get there, we need a political momentum to actually make government do it, but we can have an alternative vision with a reimagined America where everybody has the resources they need to thrive.
We're getting a ton of questions in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and move to the Q&A. And once again, everyone, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We're going to get to as many of these as we can. So I will once again ask you both to try to answer as concisely as possible so that we can get to several of these. All right, so I'll start with this question. During our push for baby bonds here in Washington state, we heard a persistent criticism related to higher education and entrepreneurship benefits, specifically that post-secondary education often becomes a negative asset when financed on debt and that only 1/3 of small businesses survive beyond 10 years. In your work, what are indicators that led to the inclusion of these benefits as wealth building activities?
Well, the question makes the point. The reason that small businesses often die is because they're underfinanced to begin with. And people are sometimes forced into entrepreneurship because they lack labor market opportunities because of a market that's discriminatory or stuck in poverty wages. And then finally, if you graduate with debt, that's the problem with education. Baby bonds, as well as other policies, are aimed at trying to rectify that.
Dr. Gresky, I'll ask this one of you, but feel free to pass it if needed. Are there any concerns or chatter of legal challenges to the idea of baby bonds?
Wow. I feel I'm going to pass on that one because I am so much not a legal scholar. Let me see what Darrick has to say on that one.
Look, that won't stop me, David. I mean, the short answer is I don't know the answer to that. I have not heard of legal challenges of it because I guess the legal challenge could come if it's race specific, but the programs are aimed at a dimension that's highly correlated with race, which is wealth. So I don't see it suffering from legal challenges.
This is a little bit technical, but I'll ask it anyway because someone wants to know, would the money go in a baby bonds account go to bonds or mutual funds, which would grow and compound faster for when the youth is 18 years old? so that she can have money for a scholarship. I guess this question is about where should baby bond resources be invested, and sort of how do you design that into a program?
Yeah, and technically they're not bonds. That was just clever alliteration in the name. They're really trust accounts, but they can be financed by government bonds, but the accounts themselves aren't bonds. But it depends on whether it's federal, state, or local level. The federal level, I mean, basically you have options. You can do it in multiple ways. But the gold standard, in my view, would be just like Social Security, something that's not at the whim of markets, but rather protected by federal treasuries. But state and localities don't have the budgets of or the protections that the federal government has, so they very well might have to be more creative in trying to invest their accounts in ways that they will grow.
Any thoughts on that, Dr. Grusky?
I don't have anything to add, but to say that was well put. Yeah.
This is another question sort of about something that we covered in the last panel about dealing with the idea of asset limits. Both programs speak to asset limits at the state level, both in DC and Connecticut. They want to know what are the implications for federal limits, particularly given the criteria around Medicaid. And I guess to sort of build on what we talked about in the last panel, how do you deal with these ideas of sort of limits to what is considered poverty in this country that may or not reflect people's lived experiences as you think about programs like baby bonds?
Well, one thing I could say is that there's a more general problem with asset limits that is raised by the baby bonds proposal, but it's a problem in and of itself. And there are many very destructive asset limits in play in our station net, a station that's supposed to solve problems, and it's not solving problems because of asset limits that are disincentivizing in ways that we would not want. And so we need to get rid of those limits in any event. But the baby bonds, I guess, calls that larger principle to the fore. But it's a problem that's been in play for some time. Often very destructive, needs to spend down what little assets you have in order to qualify. No one wants that.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly to add, I totally agree, David. And asset limits are even framed in a way as disciplining people, which is again part of the problem. That after you reach this, we will take this away from you. I think that's a problem, that we need to think about rights as a fundamental thing and not come up with these perverse incentives, particularly aimed at poor people.
Dr. Hamilton, a question specifically for you. Do you see an opportunity to retool CSAs across the country to baby bond programs? And before you answer that, can you just explain again what CSAs are?
So CSAs are savings accounts that they are held. Oftentimes, you can have CSAs that governments provide some initial endowment and even some incentive where if somebody contributes, they'll match, but they're pretty much designed as savings accounts. Baby bonds has a fundamentally different perspective. They have complements, but baby bonds is about endowment, ensuring that the state provides enough resources so that when the child gets older, that they'll have an endowment to get into that assets. So here again lies complements. I'm all for tools that incentivize and help savings, but it in and of itself won't achieve what baby bonds is trying to achieve. So I see parallels, but I don't want the ideas to get confused that they are distinct.
I understand that you don't want to be bogged down by pessimism, but can I get a gut check from each of you in terms of where we actually are in this process in the country in terms of what's next? Are we just going to see sort of more and more states doing programs like this, or local communities? Do you really think that we're going to see some sort of movement on the federal legislation in the coming year? Where's your gut check? I'm going to go with David first because I feel like I know what Dr. Hamilton's going to say.
Well, I'm very unskilled at political prognostication, but I will do it because you
never stops anyone.
Yeah, that's right. Regular caveat and then go for it. But I do think I do think people are tired of cynicism. I do believe that with my heart. I'm tired of cynicism. We need to move beyond it. We need to authentically rebuild our society so it comes closer to aligning with what we believe in. This is obviously but one step in doing that, but it's a very important step. And I think people are behind this vision of building a society that, that actually lives up to what we want, an inclusive society. That's what we're supposed to be about. How can we imagine that people won't embrace moving beyond cynicism, shallow lip service commitment, and actually getting the job done? I think I'm not going to be cynical about this because I don't think there's room for it.
We've had a 50-year run of growing inequality and concentrations of wealth that does not seem to be, that seems to be vulnerable. That seems to be vulnerable. And we can see it in some of the political actions that's taken place. In the midst of a pandemic, we had a summer of people clamoring that Black Lives Matter. We also had, on the other side, a near takeover of the Capitol with fascist and racist symbols of people, symbols of nooses, et cetera, taking on. So my point in pointing this out is that the system seems to be very vulnerable if we look at political agitation. Now, it's not a far-going conclusion that we will have something better, because fascism breeds on inequality and despair as well. So I think we need to be intentional. That's a cautionary tale, but we need to be intentional in building movements that put justice front and center. And then, the last thing, I'll end with another example, and then I'll stop. It's been 25 years since the passage of welfare reform, which marked, I guess, the culmination of a revolution where we said, we're not going to give poor people money anymore. Instead, we're going to discipline them. We're going to sanction them. We're going to only reward good behavior and punish them for bad behavior. Just recently, we passed the refundable tax credit. Unfortunately, it hasn't been renewed, but we can do something about that. But that refundable tax credit was a revolutionary break from that welfare reform revolution. So to me, that is another positive sign of optimism that we really can have something different.
Okay, let's end it on optimism that we can have something different than what we have. Dr. Hamilton and Dr. Gresky, thank you so much for your thoughts, and thank you to the audience for your questions. And I'm going to say thank you so much to the many, many people who helped organize this event, both at Prosperity Now and at the New Schools Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy. The folks who are just too many to get through are up on the screen, but I want to say a special thank you to Shira, who really carried a lot of the load on this. So thank you to everyone very much for joining us, and there are a ton of additional resources that you can find on the website and in the chat, and I'm sure that will be followed up with later. Read the paper, it's pretty interesting and lays out some details on what other states are doing, and I imagine this is going to be part of the discussion for some time to come. And so I'm going to thank everyone and wish you a wonderful rest of your week and day.